She sent her disabled son away, never saw him, never mentioned him again. And when he died at 13, she wrote in her diary that it was a great relief. That's the story, isn't it? The cold queen who hid her epileptic child on a remote farm and pretended he didn't exist. The monster mother. Here's the thing. I've read that diary entry, the full one, and it doesn't say what you think it says. Let's talk about Prince John, because this isn't really a story about Queen Mary's reputation. It's a story about a boy who lived and died, and what the people who actually knew him did, not what the internet decided they did a century later. John Charles Francis was born on the 12th of July, 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The sixth child, the youngest. His parents were the Duke and Duchess of York, not yet king and queen, not yet even next in line. His grandfather Edward VII sat on the throne. The family name was still Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, that Germanic dynasty inherited from Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, and would remain so for another 12 years until the First World War made it politically impossible to be a British monarch with a German surname. The woman who received baby John into her care was Charlotte Jane Bill. Everyone called her Lalla. Born on the 9th of December, 1875, she came from the class of respectable English women who entered domestic service not from desperation, but from vocation. The nanny profession in Edwardian England was rigorous and respected. These weren't simply babysitters, but trained professionals who managed every aspect of a child's early development. Diet, discipline, education, moral formation, sleep schedules, social training. A head nanny in a great household wielded considerable authority and commanded genuine respect from the family she served. Lalla had joined the York household in 1900, 5 years before John's birth. She'd already been raising his older brothers for 5 years. Edward, born in 1894, the boy who would briefly become Edward VIII before abdicating for Wallis Simpson, and Albert, born in 1895, who would reign as George VI through the Second World War. She'd managed their childhood illnesses, negotiated their sibling rivalries, seen them through the years when character begins to form. By the time John arrived in 1905, Lalla was 29 years old, experienced, calm, devoted, and utterly familiar with the rhythms and expectations of royal nursery life. She would become the most important person in John's short life. More present than his mother, more constant than his father. The person who held him through seizures and stayed with him through the exhausted aftermath, but we'll get to that. The early photographs show nothing unusual. A round-faced child in formal portraits with his 5 siblings. The 1906 Christmas photograph at Sandringham included all 6 children with their parents: Edward at 12, Albert at 11, Mary at 9, Henry at 6, George at 4, and baby John not yet 18 months old. A portrait commissioned for the nursery in 1908 showed John at age 3, sturdy and alert. These images capture a healthy baby prince, indistinguishable from the others, giving no hint of what was coming. Then came 1909. John was 4 years old when the first seizures appeared. The medical records, held in the Royal Archives and not publicly accessible in full, documented what the terminology of the era called fits, episodes of convulsion followed by exhaustion and disorientation that could last for hours. The diagnosis was epilepsy. Now, here's where we need to stop and understand something, because when you hear epilepsy in 2024, you think of a manageable neurological condition, medication, normal life expectancy, Olympic athletes, CEOs, people who take their pills and live completely ordinary lives. That is not what epilepsy meant in 1909. In Edwardian Britain, epilepsy was considered hereditary degeneracy, a taint in the blood that could be passed to future generations. The Lunacy Act of 1890, still in full force when John was diagnosed, permitted the institutionalization of epileptics alongside the mentally ill. They were housed in the same asylums, treated by the same alienists, considered part of the same category of defective humanity that respectable society needed to be protected from. The treatment options were essentially non-existent. The most common prescription was bromide sedatives, potassium bromide or sodium bromide, administered in doses that would horrify modern physicians. These drugs did reduce seizure frequency in some patients, but at tremendous cost. Bromide accumulated in the body, causing a constellation of side effects that doctors called bromism: mental dulling, memory impairment, skin eruptions, depression, lethargy, and what was delicately described as personality changes. A child on therapeutic doses of bromide became a shadow of themselves. Calmer, yes, but also dimmer, slower, less present. The alternative to bromide was the recommendation for quiet living, removal from stimulating environments, strict routine, avoidance of excitement or emotional upset that might trigger episodes, country air, simple food, early bedtimes, limited visitors, a life of enforced tranquility that was, in practice, a life of enforced isolation. Phenobarbital, the first effective anticonvulsant, wouldn't be introduced until 1912, 3 years after John's diagnosis, and even then it remained experimental and poorly understood for years. The side effects were significant. The dosing was imprecise. It wasn't a cure, it was a marginally better option than bromide, available to those whose doctors were aware of the latest developments and willing to try something new. There was, in 1909, no good answer for a 4-year-old with epilepsy. Only a range of bad options and worse ones. And the stigma extended beyond medicine into every corner of social life. Epileptics were considered morally weak, unfit for society, potentially dangerous. The fear of violence during seizures was widespread, though largely unfounded. The word itself carried a taint that extended to entire families. If one child had epilepsy, what did that say about the bloodline? What did it mean for marriage prospects of siblings, for political alliances, for the fundamental question of whether a dynasty was fit to rule, for a royal family, a family whose entire function was public performance and genetic continuity? An epileptic son was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political problem of the first order. This is the world Mary was navigating, not ours. On the 6th of May, 1910, King Edward VII died after a series of heart attacks at Buckingham Palace. He was 68 years old. John's father ascended to the throne as George V. Mary became Queen Consort, the highest-ranking woman in the British Empire, second only to the king himself. And John, at 4 years old with a recent epilepsy diagnosis, was suddenly the son of the reigning monarch. Every aspect of his condition now had implications beyond the family. A seizure witnessed by outsiders wasn't just distressing, it was potential ammunition for Republicans, for political enemies, for anyone who might question whether this family was fit to occupy the throne. The scrutiny on royal children intensified enormously once their father wore the crown. Everything they did, everything they were, reflected on the monarchy itself. Here's what didn't happen next. They didn't immediately hide him. The 1911 coronation photograph, taken on the 22nd of June at Buckingham Palace following George V's crowning at Westminster Abbey, shows all 6 children, John included. He's nearly 6 years old, standing at the edge of the frame in formal court dress, velvet suit, lace collar, polished shoes. He looks directly at the camera. No obvious sign of his condition, no attempt to pretend he didn't exist. This image matters. It proves that John's exclusion from family photographs came later, gradually, as his condition worsened, not as an immediate response to the diagnosis. Whatever decisions Mary made about John's visibility, they weren't made in panic the moment she learned he had epilepsy. The exclusion evolved over years. By 1912, his seizures were more frequent and more severe. The pattern that parents of epileptic children know too well had established itself. Periods of relative calm punctuated by clusters of episodes, each cluster seemingly worse than the last. Worse still, concerns emerged about his intellectual and social development, concerns documented in the medical observations of the era that have been referenced by biographers with access to the royal archives. John wasn't progressing at the same rate as his siblings. His speech development lagged. His behavior could be unpredictable, not violent, but erratic in ways that made formal social situations difficult. He had trouble following complex instructions. He became overwhelmed by stimulation that his brothers and sister handled easily. Modern retrospective analysis has suggested he may have exhibited characteristics consistent with what we'd now call autism spectrum disorder: difficulty with social cues, need for routine, sensory sensitivities, particular ways of engaging with the world that didn't match neurotypical expectations. But that terminology didn't exist in 1912. The word autism wouldn't enter psychiatric vocabulary until 1943 and wouldn't be broadly understood for decades after that. What his family knew was simply that John was different, and the gap between him and his siblings was widening rather than narrowing. He wasn't going to grow out of it. He wasn't going to catch up. Whatever was happening to him was permanent. The family photographs tell the story of gradual exclusion. The 1912 photograph marking Princess Mary's 15th birthday included all 5 older siblings arranged around her, but not John, then aged 7. The Christmas photographs from 1913 at Sandringham, 5 children. The formal portrait commissioned for the King's study in 1914, 5 children. By the time John was 8 years old, he was disappearing from the official visual record of the family. Was this shame? Concealment? Or was it that formal portrait sessions, standing absolutely still for extended periods, while photographers arranged and rearranged the composition, following precise instructions about where to look and how to hold your hands, managing the overwhelming sensory environment of flashbulbs and hot lights, and strangers barking orders, were simply beyond what John could handle? The evidence doesn't tell us definitively, but the pattern is unmistakable. The outbreak of the Great War on the 4th of August, 1914, transformed everything about royal life. King George V and Queen Mary undertook a relentless schedule of public duties that left little room for private family time. Hospital visits to wounded soldiers, troop inspections at military bases, morale-boosting appearances at factories and shipyards. The careful, constant management of public perception at a moment when the monarchy's survival was genuinely uncertain. The anti-German pressure was extraordinary. Kaiser Wilhelm II was George V's first cousin. Their mothers were sisters, both daughters of Queen Victoria. The family name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, announced their Germanic heritage every time it was spoken. In the streets of London, shops with German-sounding names had their windows smashed. Dachshunds were kicked by patriotic pedestrians. German music was banned from concert programs. The royal family's German blood had become a political liability that required constant attention. Meanwhile, in Russia, their cousins the Romanovs were facing revolution. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II, also a first cousin of George V, married to another of Queen Victoria's granddaughters, was forced to abdicate. The Bolsheviks would murder the entire family the following year. Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The message was unmistakable. Monarchies could fall. Royal families could be killed. nothing was guaranteed. In July 1917, George V issued the proclamation that changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. The German heritage that had defined the dynasty since Prince Albert married Queen Victoria was officially erased, or at least renamed into something that sounded properly English. The Kaiser is said to have joked that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But the name change was deadly serious, a survival measure for a monarchy under siege. It's in this context, anti-German hysteria, the Romanov murders, genuine uncertainty about whether the British monarchy would survive the war, that John's move to Wood Farm must be understood. Now we come to Wood Farm, and this is where the exile narrative falls apart if you actually look at what Wood Farm is. Wood Farm is a house on the Sandringham estate, not a hospital, not an asylum, not an institution designed for the care of the disabled. A house. A proper country house with multiple bedrooms, staff quarters, comfortable living spaces, a kitchen, a dining room, gardens. It sits on the grounds of the Sandringham estate, about 2 miles from the main Sandringham house, where the royal family stayed during their Norfolk visits, a distance of perhaps 30 minutes walk or a 5-minute drive along estate roads. This is not, by any reasonable definition, exile. Exile implies banishment, distance, removal from the family entirely. If Mary had wanted to exile John, truly hide him away, pretend he didn't exist, she could have placed him in one of the many institutions that existed for defective children, colonies for epileptics in remote parts of the country, private sanatoriums where wealthy families placed embarrassing relatives. He could have been sent anywhere, somewhere the press would never find him, somewhere the family would never have to see him. Instead, he was placed in a house on the family estate, 2 miles from where his parents slept when they were in residence at Sandringham, close enough for regular visits, close enough to be part of the extended household, close enough that his presence was known to everyone on the estate, from gamekeepers to gardeners to household staff. The move happened gradually between 1916 and 1917, when John was 11 and 12 years old. The specific date when his residence shifted permanently from York Cottage to Wood Farm is not recorded with precision in available sources. This was a private family matter, not a public event documented in court circulars. What is documented is that by 1917, Wood Farm had become his primary home. Lalla moved with him. She was now in her early 40s, having spent 17 years with the royal family and the last 12 specifically caring for John. She installed herself at Wood Farm as his principal caregiver, and a small household staff provided support. Maids, cooks, a gardener to maintain the grounds where John could play safely. The household was comfortable and well provisioned. John had his own rooms. He had access to gardens where he could exercise and play without observers or formal expectations. He had the quiet, routine environment that medical wisdom of the era prescribed for epileptics. But within that environment, he had freedom, space, the ability to be himself without the constraints of palace life. Critics call this exile, banishment, abandonment. But here's what Wood Farm actually was: the best available care for a child with his condition, provided within the family's own property, supervised by a devoted caregiver who loved him, close enough for regular family contact. The alternatives were worse, much worse. And Lalla, this woman whose name has been erased from most tellings of this story, reduced to a footnote if she's mentioned at all, devoted everything to John during these years. She rose with him every morning. She managed his schedule, maintaining the strict routine that helped stabilize his condition. She monitored him for the subtle signs that preceded a seizure, the changes in breathing, the distant look, the small movements that she'd learned to recognize after years of observation. When seizures came, she held him. She made sure he didn't injure himself during convulsions. She stayed with him through the exhausted aftermath, sometimes for hours, while he slowly returned to himself. She was, in every practical sense, his mother. Not biologically, not legally, but in the daily reality of who fed him and bathed him and comforted him and knew his favorite foods and understood his moods and celebrated his good days and held him through his bad ones. Lalla Bill. The relationship between Lalla and John deepened into something that transcended professional duty. She loved him. The evidence for this is everywhere once you look for it. In her correspondence with Queen Mary, in her continued connection to the royal family for decades after John's death, in the accounts of household staff who witnessed their bond. And here's what's crucial. Queen Mary knew about this relationship. She approved of it. She didn't resent Lalla for being closer to John than she herself was. She recognized that John needed what Lalla could give him, consistent, patient, devoted daily care, and she ensured he had it. This arrangement, a devoted professional caregiver providing daily nurture while the biological mother remained involved at a supervisory level, was standard practice for aristocratic families with disabled children. And indeed, for aristocratic families generally. Because here's the context that modern critics consistently miss. Edwardian aristocratic children were not raised by their biological mothers. They were raised by nannies. The nursery was a separate world within the great house, staffed by professionals, operating according to its own schedule. Children saw their parents at designated times, perhaps tea time with mother in the drawing room, a supervised visit to father's study before bed. The rest of the day belonged to nanny. This wasn't neglect. This was how things were done. The idea that a duchess or a princess or a queen would personally change nappies, prepare meals, scrub faces, and read bedtime stories is a modern projection onto a historical context where such behavior would have seemed bizarre, even improper. Mary did not raise any of her 6 children in the hands-on way modern parents expect. Not just John, all of them. Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, all of them were nursery children raised by Lalla Bill and her staff, seeing their parents at scheduled intervals. Was Mary emotionally warm? No, she wasn't. Not with John, not with any of her children. Her eldest son, the future Edward VIII, complained bitterly about his mother's emotional distance throughout his entire life. He described her as cold, unapproachable, more interested in duty than in affection. When he abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the rift with his mother never healed. He spent the rest of his life in France, not America, as some accounts incorrectly claim, nursing his grievances about his family until his death in 1972. Mary maintained a reserve that her children sometimes experienced as rejection. She did not dispense hugs and kisses freely. She believed that excessive displays of affection weakened character. She prioritized duty, discipline, and proper behavior over emotional warmth. This is true. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Any honest assessment of Queen Mary must acknowledge that she was not, by modern standards, a warm mother. But here's what's also true. Within the constraints of her role, her era, and her personality, Mary did things for John that went beyond protocol, things that demonstrated care, things that cost her something in terms of royal propriety. The village children. Royal children did not play with commoners. Full stop. This wasn't negotiable. It wasn't a guideline. It was foundational to how royal childhood worked. Their companions were selected from appropriate aristocratic families, vetted by household staff, supervised at all times. Children of earls and dukes. Children who understood how to behave around royalty, whose families had been deemed suitable through generations of court connection. For John, this protocol was relaxed. He was permitted to play with children from the Norfolk villages surrounding Sandringham. Local children. Children who weren't vetted, weren't aristocratic, weren't trained in court etiquette. Rough and tumble outdoor play, running through fields, climbing trees, the ordinary physical games of childhood that would have been considered utterly beneath the dignity of a prince under normal circumstances. The names of these playmates weren't preserved in the historical record. They were village children, not figures of historical note, and nobody thought to document their identities. But multiple accounts reference their existence. Staff members at Sandringham knew about them. The arrangement was not secret. Queen Mary either explicitly authorized it or permitted it to continue once she learned of it. Either way, she prioritized John's happiness and social development over the strict maintenance of royal protocol. She broke the rules for him, and she stayed in contact throughout his years at Wood Farm. Lalla Bill's correspondence with Queen Mary, portions of which have been quoted by biographers with access to the royal archives, shows ongoing engagement with John's condition and well-being. Mary asked after his health. She received regular reports on his seizures, their frequency, their severity, how he recovered afterward. She sent gifts on his birthday and at Christmas. She inquired about his daily activities, his moods, what he enjoyed. The royal family continued spending significant time at Sandringham throughout the war years. Sandringham was their country residence, their retreat from the pressures of London, and they visited regularly despite the demands of wartime duties. Wood Farm was a 2-mile walk from the main house. The court circular didn't record private family movements within the estate. Those weren't public engagements, so no official log of visit frequency exists. But the physical proximity meant that contact was not merely possible, it was routine. In a letter written shortly after John's death, Mary described him as having been more of a companion than ever since the war, during their Sandringham visits. This directly contradicts the claim that she abandoned him and never saw him. She was seeing him, regularly, enough to notice that their relationship had deepened as he grew older. Now, the diary entry. On the evening of the 18th of January, 1919, Prince John suffered a severe epileptic seizure at Wood Farm. He was 13 years old, still a child, but on the threshold of adolescence. Lalla Bill was with him, as she was most nights, having spent nearly 2 decades in service to the family, and the last several years devoted almost exclusively to John's care. The seizure was worse than previous episodes. John had been having bad stretches for months, clusters of fits that left him exhausted and disoriented, each recovery seeming to take longer than the last. This time, his heart stopped. He died in his bed at Wood Farm, with Lalla at his side. Here's what Queen Mary wrote in her diary that night. The full entry, as reproduced in published accounts by biographers with access to the royal archives. At 5:30, a telephone message came from Wood Farm, Wolferton, that our poor, darling little Johnny had passed away suddenly after one of his attacks. The news gave me a great shock, though for the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great relief. I broke the news to George, and we motored down to Wood Farm. Found poor Lalla very resigned, but heartbroken. Little Johnny looked very peaceful, lying there. Read that again, slowly. Our poor, darling little Johnny. Our, possession, darling, affection, little Johnny. The diminutive, the endearment. The name you use for someone you love. The news gave me a great shock. Not expectation, not finally. Shock. She wasn't waiting for this call. We motored down to Wood Farm. She went, that evening, immediately upon receiving the news. She and George got in a car and drove to see their dead son. Found poor Lalla very resigned, but heartbroken. She noticed Lalla's grief. She acknowledged it. She understood the bond between John and his nanny, and she recorded it as worthy of mention in her private account of that terrible evening. Little Johnny looked very peaceful lying there. She saw his body. She was present. She stood in his room and looked at his face after death. And yes, for the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great relief. This is the phrase critics seize upon, the supposed proof of her callousness. How could a mother feel relief at her child's death? But here's what that phrase actually means, in context. John's seizures had been worsening for years. Each episode risked brain damage or death. The medical prognosis offered no hope of improvement, only continued deterioration. His restless soul, in Mary's words, the agitation, the suffering, the unpredictability of his condition, would never find peace in life. The doctors couldn't help him. The treatments didn't work. There was no cure coming. There was only more of the same, getting slowly worse, until his body gave out. Relief that his suffering had ended is not monstrous. It's the honest response of a parent watching a child endure a degenerative condition with no cure. Anyone who has lost someone to a long illness knows this feeling. The terrible gratitude that the struggle is finally over. The guilt that coexists with that gratitude. The love that doesn't diminish just because you're glad they're not suffering anymore. Relief coexisting with grief, not replacing it. Mary's diary entry captures exactly this complexity. The shock of loss, alongside the acknowledgement that death ended suffering. The personal grief, alongside the recognition of Lalla's grief. The formality of passed away, alongside the intimacy of little Johnny. But it only gets quoted in fragments, stripped of context, weaponized against her by people who never read the whole thing. 3 days later, on the 21st of January 1919, Prince John was buried at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene at Sandringham. This was the parish church that had served the royal family for generations, the same church where John had been christened in August 1905, where the family attended services during every Sandringham residence, where generations of royal servants and estate workers had been married and buried. King George V and Queen Mary attended the funeral, both of them, together. The service was private, as befitted a child who had lived a private life, but it was not hidden, not shameful, not conducted in secret. John was buried in the churchyard in a marked grave that remains accessible to visitors today. The headstone identifies him as Prince John, with his dates of birth and death. You can go to Sandringham and stand at his grave. It's not concealed. It never was. The Daily Mirror reported on the 20th of January that, when the prince passed away, his mother, Queen Mary, was at Sandringham, but the king was in London and at once motored to Sandringham. Contemporary newspaper coverage, written at the time by journalists working from information provided by the palace, confirms that Mary was already there. She was already close. She didn't have to travel to say goodbye. She was at Sandringham when John died, and George came to join her. The Times published an obituary acknowledging that John had developed epilepsy, and for some years the prince had lived in retirement at Sandringham. Brief, dignified coverage. The press of the era cooperated with royal discretion in ways that modern tabloids would never accept. But the fact of John's life and death was publicly acknowledged. His existence was a matter of public record, not erased, not denied. So what about the silence that followed? After John's death, the royal family did not speak publicly about him in any sustained way. No memoirs were published, no commemorations were held. His name appeared rarely in official histories of the period. This silence has been interpreted as proof that they wanted to pretend he never existed, as confirmation of shame, of rejection, of the monster mother narrative. But consider the alternative interpretation. Public displays of mourning were considered vulgar by the aristocracy of this era. Discussing family medical conditions was considered indecent. The idea that a queen should give interviews about her disabled son, publish accounts of his life, or speak openly about her grief, these concepts belong to a completely different era, with completely different values about privacy, disability, and royal accessibility. Mary's silence about John was consistent with how she handled every private matter. She didn't discuss her feelings publicly, about John or about anything else. This was not specific rejection of her disabled son. This was her entire approach to private life. It was private. Her private diaries, however, continued to mark John's memory in the years following his death. She noted the anniversaries of his birth and death. She kept mementos of him, photographs, small objects, the treasures that parents hold on to after a child dies. The private record did not erase John, even as he faded from public memory. And Lalla Bill? She remained connected to the royal family until her death on the 13th of December, 1964, at 89 years old. She received a pension in recognition of her service. For 45 years after John's death, she maintained her relationship with the family she'd served, decades of continued connection, of being remembered and provided for. This is hardly the treatment you'd expect if John's care had been a shameful secret everyone wanted to forget. You don't pension someone for nearly half a century if you're trying to erase all evidence of their service. You don't maintain connection with the woman who knew your secrets if those secrets are truly shameful. So here's my closing argument. Was Queen Mary emotionally warm? No, she wasn't. Not with John, not with any of her children. The future Edward VIII resented her distance his entire life, spending his post-abdication decades in France, nursing grievances about his cold, duty-bound mother. Did Mary conform to modern standards of maternal involvement? Absolutely not. She delegated daily care to Lalla Bill. She maintained the aristocratic distance typical of her class and era. She prioritized duty to the crown over personal demonstrations of affection. But did she abandon her disabled son? Did she exile him in shame and never see him again? Did she erase him from memory and feel nothing when he died? No. The evidence says no. She placed him in a comfortable family property on the Sandringham estate, 2 miles from the main house, not 200. She installed a devoted caregiver who had raised all her children and loved John fiercely. She broke royal protocol to let him play with village children, prioritizing his happiness over aristocratic propriety. She visited during the family's regular Sandringham residences, frequently enough that she described him as more of a companion than ever since the war. She received regular reports on his health. She sent gifts. She maintained involvement in his care even as she delegated its daily execution. And when he died, she was already at Sandringham. She went to Wood Farm that same evening. She saw his body. She attended his funeral 3 days later. She wrote about him in her private diary with language of affection and possession. Our poor, darling little Johnny. Was she a product of her times? Yes, obviously. She was constrained by medical ignorance that offered no effective treatment for epilepsy. She was constrained by royal obligations that demanded a controlled public face at all times. She was constrained by social expectations about disability, about maternal behavior, about privacy, expectations that would seem alien to us today. She made decisions within those constraints, not perfect decisions. Not decisions that a modern mother would make, but decisions that prioritized John's well-being and happiness according to the best understanding available to her, within the limits of what her position and era allowed. She put duty to the crown first. That cost her something as a mother. All those years of formal distance, all those scheduled visits instead of spontaneous affection, all those decisions weighed against public perception. She was not the warm, present, hands-on mother that modern parenting ideals demand. But it didn't make her the villain history painted her as. The monster mother narrative is a modern invention, assembled from fragments of evidence stripped from context, judged by standards that didn't exist in 1919, designed to satisfy our contemporary hunger for clear villains in historical stories. It says more about our need for simple moral judgments than about who Mary actually was. Prince John lived for 13 years. He was loved by Lalla Bill. He was cared for at Wood Farm on his family's estate. He played with village children in the Norfolk countryside. He had a bedroom and a routine and gardens to run in. And when he died, his mother called him her poor, darling little Johnny, and she went to see him that same night, and 3 days later she buried him in the churchyard where he'd been christened. That's what the diary actually says. That's what the evidence shows. You can decide for yourself what it means. Subscribe for more stories like this.